Okay, so I'm joined here today with Allen Stroud. So, Alan, welcome.
Thank you.
So, Alan is a university lecturer at the at University of Coventry, and he's also the author of the Fractal series of science fiction books, which I've talked about on this channel. Kind of hard SF space opera series set in the 22nd century. Um, and it's a very intense and exciting and thrilling series with some really interesting ideas. So we're going to talk about that series in a little bit. It all starts off with this book, Fearless, which is one of my favorite reads so far this year, actually. Um, yeah, but before we get into that, I just wanted to ask you, Alan, a little bit about your background and your interest in science fiction in general, because you're not just a writer, you're also the chair of the British Science Fiction Association. Um, so, and you also write reviews for science fiction. You're involved in quite a few different projects related to speculative fiction in different ways. So, yeah, can you tell me a bit about your background in sci-fi, and has this always been a lifelong interest for you?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, thank you very much for the generous thoughts on the books. First of all, I should say, you know, I think that there's a little reflection actually in the prologue of Vigilance that gives a little bit of an indication as to how far back the obsession with kind of thinking about spaceships and thinking about humanity leaving Earth and doing stuff, and and all those kind of exciting things that the young kids dream about when they look up at the stars. Yeah, I think uh, I was probably thinking about these kind of things from quite a young age. I was reading fantasy and before that mythology from about the age of 7 or 8. Um, and then my uncle introduced me to The Hobbit. After reading Greek myths, he introduced me to The Hobbit, and then from The Hobbit, then they give you the bigger book and stuff. But I prior to that, I'd had little collections of science fiction stories. I collected the Eagle comic since 1981. I think it came back. So I had from the run that was the Fleetway run, the returning run from the 1980s, not the original 50s version. Um, Absolutely adored that. So I've been reading that since sort of age 5, 5 or 6. Love the illustrative nature of it. The artist who they got in at the time was incredible, and really kind of fired me. And like every child of that era, you try and find ways to get what's in your head out. And I couldn't draw, and I did try to draw. There were times when I did try to get these things down, and I was a bit better as a sort of a map maker or a kind of schematic drawer. So I could draw a spaceship shape and then divide it into a load of rooms. Uh, and you know, with with lifts and airlocks and stuff. I could do that, but I
Yeah,
couldn't make the spaceship look good, in any way. I could make it look like a map, but I couldn't make it look good. So, you know, as with all kids, you try and get, as I say, you try and get the imagination out. So Lego became a thing, and so
yeah,
Lego was a big thing. And I think it's important to kind of make a small distinction here, because much as we had Lego Space at that period in time, Lego Space didn't prescribe to you specifically what the mythos was. There was a certain amount of mythos with Lego Space. One of my favorite books of reading this year is somebody's done a book on that particular mythos, which is amazing. But anyway, there wasn't a specific mythos, so you weren't having to sort of replicate Star Wars. You weren't having to replicate Marvel, or you weren't having to replicate something else like that. So you could invent your own, kind of, and that always spoke to me. So whether it was at sort of Lego Spaceman scale, little tiny scale, or it was a smaller scale that was kind of something that could represent the same scale as Battlestar Galactica or Star Trek or Star Wars. I wanted to have my own kind of proto-imaginative idea of what that future would be. And yeah, so it manifested in a variety of different places. How connected that is to what I do now, I don't know. I can kind of, it was an interesting exercise in reflection for the prologue for the third book was about thinking, going, oh, actually, I was thinking about that, wasn't I? I was thinking about that when I was this age, and whether those two things were sort of subconsciously connected, I'm not sure, but it was certainly an early start. Then I played a few role-playing games. I've done that with both fantasy and science fiction. I did veer more towards fantasy initially, probably as a teenager, and then into my 20s, and thinking, certainly in writing, I thought I'd be a fantasy writer before I'd be a science fiction writer, mostly because I think formatively I wasn't sure my science was up to it.
Right.
And now I have to be very, very careful. I try to make sure my science is up to it. There've been one or two moments where I've gone, and not been happy with it. So I thought I veered more toward fantasy, and then the Elite Dangerous book came along in 2013. Had the opportunity to do that. So then that started to make me perhaps take a look the other way. Did some of the Phoenix Point writings, and that sort of built me towards the style and the tone and the method of writing Fearless, which then carried straight on into Resilient and carried straight on into Vigilance, in terms of finishing that specific story, which obviously
Right.
is set in a wider setting.
Yeah, because I think this series, the Fractal series, is kind of on the harder end of science fiction. I think it goes into it feels quite plausible, the scientific and the technical detail. And I would imagine, that if you need some kind of scientific understanding to craft that kind of story. Whereas I guess, even though I'm not a writer myself, with fantasy world building, you can create whatever rules you like. You can explain it with magic, right?
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can, but you generally have to be consistent within those rules.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of systematized fantasy that makes the rules explicit. Um, and similarly, I kind of brought some of that idea to science fiction, really, in that I would suggest, and people have suggested, that what I write is on the harder end of science fiction. Okay, that's fine. I'm happy to take that. However, it doesn't mean that the characters who are narrating my stories know everything. They
Right.
don't. And they also have colloquial ways of speaking, which do not necessarily represent the way in which the physics works or the way in which certain things work. Case in point here, it is common parlance for people to talk about stopping, but being completely stopped in space is virtually impossible, because
Right.
your movement is relative to every other object that is around you. But it is a parlance to say, bring us to bring us to a stop, bring us to, put the brakes on. I don't know, whatever you, however you want to kind of think about the kind of colloquial nature of how people are going to talk. And I think that's useful. frankly, as a writer, sometimes it can get a little confused, in that people will go, oh, but actually it's useful as a writer because it's a useful device, because you're speaking through your character. So actually the character will have a way in which they are describing the nature of the activity that's going on around them.
Okay. But in terms of the physics
Mhm.
and the technology and the science in general, which is quite realistic in this series, did you have to do any research
Mm.
into to making
Mm.
sure those ideas make sense, or they're based on real science? Or
Yeah, there's a few. There are one or two things where they always say a writer's search history is probably not something you want to necessarily spend any time thinking too hard about. Always, I spend time on what happens to blood in zero gravity. That gets a treatment every time there's an injury. I kind of go back and retread the research that's related to that. Specifically, looking at different ways in which things operate in a vacuum, and the different ways in which things operate in different gravitational stresses, then looking at how much G the human body can tolerate. It's interesting that there are different margins that um, different stories use. So you can probably find the same tabular calculations, that are, or the same NASA statistics that talk about how much G you can survive for how long, and so on. But actually, the way in which that's often interpreted by writers is always slightly different, in terms of what they do. Yeah, every time you kind of look at these things and go, oh, I hope I got it right. and probably my imposter syndrome flares up more in that regard than almost anything else in my life. Second, probably only to every time I stand in front of students, which has been the case for, I've been doing that job for 22 years now. So, by now I should have got used to it. But every time, I kind of teach on the fear of being found out. And I think as a writer, there's a little bit of that, in terms of why you try and do the research, because you don't want to, to do something that you then kind of makes you gnash your teeth and makes you. I'm a very self-critical person, so
right.
I would probably spend quite a lot of sleepless time worrying about something utterly ridiculous and inane. Whereas, whoever had read it and pointed it out would probably then just forget about it. So
But
yeah.
I suspect for most readers, they're not going to pay attention to that kind of detail or be any wise. I mean, if you're like an astrophysicist, maybe you will pick up these things. But I think for most of us, it so long as it sounds plausible, we can still call it
Yeah.
hard SF or
Mm.
scientific. Yeah. um, but yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the Fractal series. So starts off with Fearless,
Mhm.
which came out in 2020, I believe. And you mentioned Resilient, which is the second book, which came out a couple of years ago. And most recently, Vigilance, which I've just reviewed on my channel. And this is a pre-release copy. It hasn't actually been published yet. It's due to be published in September. And besides that, we've got the episode series spin-off.
Mhm.
So for those who perhaps don't know, perhaps you could just introduce this series. What is it about?
Sure. So Fearless is pretty much it's the Wrath of Khan set in the near future. So it's a duel between two spaceships. And initially envisaged with those ideas in mind. I was at the time I was watching the Expanse television series, so that clearly had something of an influence on me. It also covers some of the things that are important to me as a writer. Representation of disabled characters in space is incredibly important to me as a writer. So Fearless is a representation, at least some of it is a representation of a disabled character. Specifically, not a representation of a disabled character where their disability is the main focus of the story, which is what happens sometimes. Nothing wrong with that necessarily, but this wasn't what we were going to do here. Elisa Shan is the captain of a spaceship. The fact that she has no legs is just that's who she is. And then the story happens, and she makes decisions, pushes the story, reacts to the story, etc., etc. Events are shaped by her, and also they shape her in turn. And we get to an end where it was a pretty awful crisis for her. Resilient picks that up and allows her to process some of the elements of what's there. Resilient kind of deals with, I think, a little bit more, because it was hinted at in Fearless, the issues of post-trauma, and looking at the ways in which crisis decisions make people make judgments, and then how they reflect on those judgments in the quiet times afterwards. So sometimes when you have to craft simple decisions because of the fact that you have no time, how you then process that, which I think is one of the crucial themes of Resilient. But we also expand the story. Resilient I generally describe as Die Hard on a space station, and that kind of gives you a clue as to to some of the elements that are there. And then Vigilance is really wraps up quite a lot of those elements, because we introduced an alien spaceship arriving at the end of Resilient, and then that's then explored the nature of what that might mean, and what has happened previously is explored in Vigilance. The episodes then sort of weave their way in and out of that. So there are themes that are touched on in all three books that are then expanded into stories that are happening concurrently with the events of the three books themselves. So you have Europa, where there is an issue with a research facility, and they realize there's something wrong with some of the cargo they brought with them. Something happens, people get injured, stuff. And then Ceres, there's an incident on a mining station. Lagrange Point, there is an incident on whilst the freighter Hercules, which is featured in Fearless, whilst that freighter is in dock, there's an anomaly with its cargo, and that is kind of explored. Then Terra is in the aftermath, is set on Earth, and is in the aftermath of an explosion that occurs at the beginning of Resilient. And then Luna is set on the moon, and it involves the kidnapping of a character that is mentioned in Fearless and then is expanded on in Resilient. And then finally, Jezero is the aftermath on Mars, just after a space station has exploded, which is what happens in Resilient. So they all weave in and out of the story, and so give you a little bit of different perspectives as to what's going on elsewhere.
Right, and these episodes, they're shorter than the novels, right? They're more like novellas.
Yeah. I'd like to call them novellas.
But officially, they're called episodes.
Yeah, Flame Tree would like to call them episodes,
Okay.
which I think is entirely fine. So essentially they're 20 to 25. I think 28,000 is probably the longest one.
Yeah.
So they basically deal with those things in a kind of shorter element in terms of what's going on.
But the episodes, I've only read one of the episodes so far, and that was Europa. Enjoyed that one. Probably will get around to reading more of them, but as I understand it, you don't have to read those in any particular order. and you can read them at any point before
Yeah,
or after or during the main series,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah,
They don't kind of hinge the plot, as it were.
yeah,
That may change a little bit, tiny bit going forwards. But the plan is to continue in a similar vein. We are looking at some shorter works and some novel works that will move the Fractal series forward. Um, so there are one or two of the episodes on the next slate which you probably will have wanted to read a certain book before you read that episode.
right.
But I mean, it's not absolutely contingent on it, but some of the context will be explained, in each one as they go. So yeah.
Yeah. So, and where did you? I know we've talked a little bit about your background in science
Mhm.
fiction and writing fantasy and all that, but specifically in terms of um, this Fractal series and Fearless, was there something which kind of sparked off your interest and gave you the impetus to start this narrative?
Yeah. So there were a couple of reasons. The themes that I mentioned were important to me, and they kind of coalesced one day. I sat down one day and they went. And I also, when I first imagined myself as a writer, I thought I would be writing quite traditional third person past prose.
Yeah,
That's what I read, and that's what I assumed I would be writing. Um, that said, War of the Worlds had a profound effect on me when I was younger. I had the Jeff Wayne full version on my uncle's stereo with big headphones, which was an amazing experience, and that was that also had a strong connected effect to me. And I'd started writing. This was about 2016. I'd started writing first person present stories, and I've been struck by the immediacy of it and the connectedness of it and the way in which you could make things feel very visceral. And also as a writer, I'd also been quite taken by the fact that you can hide things too. There are ways in which you can narrow the focus so that certain things that might be difficult in the heavy lifting elements that might be difficult in the plot, the character may not necessarily know. So that makes some things a little easier, some things a little bit more difficult. And I was looking to explore that as a writing style, still of the mind that I couldn't write a novel like that. I thought I'd be exhausted. I thought it would be exhausting to be in that perspective for so long, to be quite right near the action, frenetically, absolutely there. I thought, oh, I won't be able to do that. But anyway, the ideas coalesced, and I thought, well, okay, well, let's start. And I started, and the book started to come together very quickly, and I started to realize there wasn't an end. This was a full story. I wasn't going to finish it in 15,000 words. I wasn't going to finish it in 20. I didn't know what it was going to be. And gradually these elements sort of wove together. And when I'd finished it, I was struck by, firstly, I was worried I hadn't done it justice. I started to send out, started to speak to people about it. And I was nervous because in the past when I've sent stuff out, I've been fine with, sending it out and sending it around, and rejections are fine. You process that, you move on, you develop, you either rewrite or you move on to a new project. But with this, I was really worried that I hadn't done the themes justice. And then had the opportunity to talk to Flame Tree in Dublin in 2019. I'd finished the draft, I think, 6 months before, and then Nick said, "Well, I'm off to China a week after this. If you can send me the book now, I'll read it on the plane." So okay, and so he went off to China, came back a couple of weeks later and said, "Yeah, this is great, love it. Right, let's do this." And at that point, I kind of realized we were onto something, we were doing something. Um, I also realized I had a one book contract. Um, and so, Fearless was written in a way that tried to ensure that I would have more than one book contract. And it was interesting actually, because, we've had a couple of discussions since then. And really now, despite my imposter syndrome, in terms of writing this series, I can explore it how I want to explore it, which is really nice. We've had one or two conversations because I know where I'm going.
Yeah.
Um, there is a kind of a point quite a way down the line that will allow things to sort of move forward. But I quite like this idea of continuing without necessarily being bound by, and this is what the episodes have done for me, because the episodes were, for me, it was the publisher's idea initially, and I then tried to see if I could do it. What the episodes have allowed me to do is create a kind of more of a Aristotelian mess of characters across lots of different places. And so I'm not bound by anyone, so I can sit and we can continue Shan's adventures. I love Shan as a character. I really want to do more with Shan, but we don't have to. We've got other characters that we can explore, and we can move in different directions depending on what inspiration works. So yeah, it's been a very interesting process, and I would say it's been a much more organic process than maybe it looks like from the outside. I hadn't planned a lot of elements in terms of what's there, which is quite surprising because I used to be an incredible planner. But the more and more I've got into this particular writing style, the more and more it's become just instinctive and go. And then and my first drafts are pretty close. They're pretty close to the final versions. Or occasionally we have a plot crisis and I go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot blah. But that's fine. We can deal with that. That's why we have proofreading. So yeah, there's one or two things like that. But actually, yeah, it's become more organic as we've gone along.
Yeah, you mentioned your writing style, first person present, which you employed in these books, and I agree that it creates a very kind of immediate sense of urgency because this series is essentially a thriller. There's a lot of intense action going on, and because it's written in the first person between rotating characters, it feels quite intimately told. This form of narration, it's one of the most distinctive features of this book and this series that I remember from reading them. So, but one thing that I mentioned in my Fearless review was that it kind of feels like the book. It feels like it's taking place in real time.
Mm.
It's like the events don't stop, the characters don't stop, the reader doesn't get a break, let alone the characters.
Yeah.
Is that the effect that you were going for?
Yeah, I mean there are one or two things actually. There are sort of pluses and minuses to it. So to evaluate, I can't quite evaluate the reading experience, but I can kind of give a bit of a take in that I am understanding of the reading experience in terms of what's there. Yeah, there is this, it's basically 24 the television series, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then we do this, and then we do this, and it's not just reactive; it's also, proactive in that regard. But yeah, there is this relentlessness to the circumstances, and actually, when you think about stuff like Apollo 13, or even the successful missions, if you think about the successful Apollo missions, what they talk about is long processes of stuff that they have to do, and they talk about circumstances where someone has to stay awake, or complicated procedures of this button pushed at this point, and this done at this point, and this done at this, and so on, to maintain different materials. And you see when, if you look at special forces training, for example, completely different theatre, but one of the things that they train soldiers to do is to operate when tired. So they basically just keep them up and make them perform repetitive actions when they are exhausted, to try and ingrain this idea of people performing under stress. And so I suppose there's like a vicarious quality that you're trying to get across to the reader in that regard. Perhaps it's slightly cruel. It also, there's a weakness, and there is a weakness to this, and I absolutely understand the weakness to this. If you put this book down after about a few chapters and you walk away and then you come back, you may lose where you are. That's the weakness, because the immediacy demands of you. And so it's such a swirl of events, particularly in, Fearless initially, when I was perhaps less aware of the effect element. Because there's such a swirl of events. Yeah, you can lose your train, in terms of what's there. So it is, it's difficult for a writer to sit here and say, hey, you should read my book and just don't put it down. Just read it all. Read all 3 books in one setting. You can't obviously advise people to do that. But at the same time, you have to, to bear in mind that it is such an involved swirl of events, that it can be tricky to lose track. One of the things that the author's got to get right, and I try really hard, and here's my imposter syndrome again, characters have to have distinct voices. They must have distinct voices. Sometimes characters will have more distinct voices than others. Some characters will be more distinct, just depending on their nature. And you're trying to, you don't want to force that. You don't want to sit there and go, okay, I need this person to sound like this, and I need this person to, to be like this. But what I tend to find is when I get a character, some character voices come to me quite quickly. Other character voices don't, but they feel, you sort of, when you're writing them, you're trying to figure out the distinction between them. Celis in Fearless, who is the third narrative perspective in Fearless, after Shan and Johansson. Celis, for me, Celis's voice is the most distinct, because when I decided to write his perspective, it felt very much like a counterweight perspective, and I was trying to think of someone who just, did not care about the things that the others cared about necessarily, but would still be bound to them in some way, and and so on and so forth. So he felt the most distinct initially, and then later on, when I've done the episodes, you're then trying to find ways in which these people are definitely different to each other, the ways in which they narrate, the ways in which they talk, the ways in which they act, how they are different to each other in terms of what they do. Yeah, I mean, sometimes as well, when you go from a kind of supporting cast character, when a supporting cast character then becomes a main character, that then requires some change, because it requires a little bit of your thinking about who that person is, and and how they are, but also you're going deeper, into the motivations of them. And I'm not, here not trying to spoil Vigilance, but there are examples in Vigilance of characters that have gone from supporting cast to being main cast, and therefore narrating part of the story. I was also quite conscious of how many perspectives as well, because the more perspectives you push in, the trickier it is to ensure that everyone is distinct. So yeah.
But well, speaking of character building, I find there are some aspects of the plot in the series, and I won't go into any detail because I don't want to spoil anything, which kind of make things a little bit more complicated, I think, in terms of the technology and how they affect someone's character. I'm talking about things like consciousness transfer and digital uploads of personality and these kind of things, and which I think would be the kind of challenge that only really a science fiction writer has to deal with. But yeah, I'm also curious in when you about your creative process, right?
Mm,
So I think there's I've I don't really do any writing myself, but I'm curious, like you've got several layers to your
mm.
creativity. You've got your world building, you've got your characters, and you've got the plot, right? So for you, when you were sort of designing or writing these novels, how did you go about this? Did you have an idea of where you wanted the plot to go to start with, or did you just have some characters in your mind to start with, or did they come up later? How did that work
Okay,
out? So
so I've always got an idea at the end of the book. So I
right,
always have an idea of where we're going to land. Um, Sometimes, depending on the word count, will depend on exactly where we land. Sometimes you'll land here, or sometimes you'll land a little further on, or you'll move things a little bit around. But I've pretty much always got an idea of where we're going to land. Um, as my PhD's in world building, um, but the more I've developed as a writer, the more I've grown to hate doing any writing that is not actually the story.
right,
So the kind of timelining, the kind of other peripheral elements, and I've done tie-in fiction as well. I've worked for different franchises, and those moments where somebody says to you, "Yes, we'd like to commission you. Can you send us a complete outline of how the story is going to begin and end, a complete synopsis of the story?" And I sit there going, I would rather be writing the story. Thank you very much. You have to do it. If you're going to work for somebody, you got to work to their process. But for me, I'd rather put the words in the story, because sometimes I can find the synopsis process sterile,
yeah,
in that I will get part way through a scene and I will take a break and I'll go do something else. 5 minutes in the garden, or something completely unconnected, and that allows my mind to kind of stretch, relax, think in a different direction, and then and then I will come back, and I'll kind of, the scene will move and it will change, and it will add vibrancy to what's there. um so yeah, this series has become more and more pantsing than plotting, and I think I was probably going in that direction towards at the start when I began Fearless. But when I did start Fearless, it just dump, just and we were away. And so that really, I've tried to honor that, to a point, because that's when the vibrancy's there. And it also means that sometimes, in the moment of when you're reading about the character not knowing what on earth they're going to do, well, when I was writing the story, I had no idea what they were going to do either. And then I went away for 10 minutes and I went, yeah, that's what they're going to do. So yeah, so sometimes that, that's quite, it's life imitating art. Um, the, the, there is a danger there. And this used to be the case when I first started writing, is, um, when I first started many, many years ago, I would write a whole load of stuff, and then my characters would sit down and think about everything, and reflect on everything that had just happened. And so the pace would just fall off a cliff, because what I was actually doing is I was writing a load of stuff in a week, and then I would go away and do nothing for a week or two, and then I'd come back. And the reflection element was me trying to write myself back into the story, as in trying to get myself familiar again with where I'd left them. And you just can't do that. You just destroy your everything you're trying to create. All the kind of underlying elements of writing, you break by working in that way. So you have to keep some kind of idea of where you're at. I'm very blessed now with, I've got a good editorial team. They are fantastic. The Flame Tree people are brilliant. They've kept track of a couple of things for me over the series. So actually, generally, if I'm referring to something and I'm writing a new book, I go back to the old book. So I reread the old book to figure out, because I kind of think that actually, sometimes it's best to just reread the novel and and figure out what you did. So sometimes I'm going back to the old book to do it, but actually they've done 1 or 2 summary sheets that we keep. So I at least have those occasionally to rely on, and they use those as kind of guards against me saying something slightly wrong. Whether I've called a piece of tech, something, and then later I've called it something else, or a company name is slightly different, and so on and so forth. We've got a system now of trying to keep track of some of those things.
Okay, great. So we've got this trilogy of novels.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the 6 episodes, and you've alluded to possible further expansion in the future. But one thing I haven't mentioned, which is also part of your whole Fractal universe, is you've also constructed or composed a soundtrack, right, for the episodes to complement the series, and which I think is quite an interesting idea, that like composing music to go with a fiction, basically. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about that.
So it probably kind of connects into what I was just saying, really, and that when I had that problem when I was writing before, of getting myself back in, music gets me back in. So I've always composed music since I was at school. I'm not a particularly gifted piano player. And I'm also, most composers have they have a method, and they will stick to their method. And so quite often that method is not the most technologically advanced, or it's not the most, so I got into high-end 90s hard synthesizers about 15 years after everybody else did, which works for me because they're cheaper. So the sort of the basis of my my composing studio, which is in the loft, is 90s synthesizers, and then I got into soft synths. Again, I think they became popular in sort of 2005, and I probably got into them in about 2021, or 2020. So, I've gradually learned different techniques in terms of what I do with my composing. But what I've always been trying to do is instrumental music that is either science fiction or fantasy based. I did a series of tracks when I did the Elite Dangerous book, Elite Lave Revolution. So that was part of a Kickstarter. So when we did the Kickstarter, it was one of the rewards was to get the music. Because when you're running a Kickstarter, you just sit there and think, well, what can I give? What can I make that could be a reward? And actually, music was part of it. But what I found during that process was I had certain scenes that were happening in the story, and they were expressed better in music than they were in the book. So there's a moment when in Elite Lave Revolution, when the ship that a couple of the main characters are on is crashing into the atmosphere of Lave, and what happens is the characters pass out, and then they wake up in a rubble field. The ship is absolutely smashed to pieces, and they have to make a run for it, and they're picked up by some rebels and blah 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 blah. But the actual crash of the ship, there's no scene, because there's a piece of music that is composed to try and get the image out of my head about the crash of the ship. So you can then kind of plug that backwards, as it were. So if you remember when we were talking at the start about me being an imaginative child and trying to get those images out of my head in some way, music became another means to do that. And it's certainly become a means more and more as I've got perhaps a bit more sophisticated at being able to do it. So I then wrote a variety of tracks for different people. I've written stuff for audio drama. The You may well have seen Emily's The Dex Legacy on social media. All the music for The Dex Legacy I composed. Emily and I met, a few years ago, and she was looking to try and get a piece of music as a soundtrack for it. And I said, well, give me a few hours, and I went up to the loft and came back and said, what about something like this? And she went, this is great. So that was good. And and since then we've continued to work together. So I've just done some stuff for her new spin-off series, which she's working on. So yeah, and then Flame Tree basically spoke to me. I said to them, I've composed music. And Nick Wells, who's the CEO, Nick is also a composer, and he's a guitarist. So Nick and I kind of have those conversations. We were speaking earlier today, actually, and you get all the business out of the way, and then we spent 15 to 20 minutes just talking composition, and he's talking about the things he does with his method, and I, talk about the things I do with mine. And he just took a listen to some of the stuff, and he went, this is great. Like, can we do an album? Yeah, sure. Okay, how many tracks? Well, this many tracks. Okay, fine. So I'd already done 2 or 3. And then I just went, right, fine, okay. So we went through and did 12 or 13. I mean, there are some bonus tracks as well. All of that's being showcased at our Worldcon launch. So the Vigilance is going to have a launch at Worldcon, and the music is going to be kind of showcased there as well. And then that'll be available to buy. But I mean, there's sort of 6, 7 tracks are on Spotify, on Amazon, on Apple, so you can already listen to some of it in terms of what's there. But yeah, it's it's very much part of the process for me. It's very much I need to see something, and so the track becomes my way of getting back there, visualizing something. And it may well be that it doesn't always happen that the track is the scene that I couldn't write. Sometimes it's that the track is just there to get me back to where I was. And you kind of then hope that a listener will have that too, that they will find that it adds to the atmospheric of what they're doing. Or even they're trying to create their own things. And they just, they think, what, if I put this on, maybe this will inspire me. Great. If I can do that for a few people, then, I'm delighted.
Do you think if the Fractal series were ever commissioned to be audiobooks, do you think you could implement the soundtrack into that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's what we did with Lave Revolution when that went to audio. The album just became the all of it, So basically, John Williams, the whole production. I think you can either use it. You go one or two ways. Either if it's an audio book, a narrated audio book, then you might look at 1 or 2 pieces of music to either kind of begin it or end it, or there might be 1 or 2 illustrative sections that you want to kind of break out and give it some music to kind of reinforce the moment. But more than likely, you move to audio drama, and then you do a complete adaptation, and then the music becomes part of the kind of atmos of all the tone, the thematics, the aesthetic of the production in terms of what they do.
Is that something you would like to do?
Love to. Always do. The only issue with it, it's a lot of production. How profitable, is always a concern. And any publisher has got to think about things that way. They can't just look at these things and go, hey, let's put loads of stuff into this to make a huge audio drama. Well, will we like it? But hello, anybody out there listening? Yeah, it's a tricky thing.
Yeah.
So.
But I can imagine it would work well. Fearless. If money is no object, get a really stellar cast and a soundtrack, and I think it would be amazing.
I always
Yeah.
get told that I have too many characters. That's my, that's the thing that, we certainly when Lave Revolution happened, the audio producer is a friend. He said to me, "Oh man, you just had so many characters in your books, because of course every character is a voice, so they're having to think about who plays what, and so on. So yeah, but we got Toby Longworth for Lave Revolution, and he played like 8 or 9 different parts. So if you don't know Toby Longworth, um his one of his screen credits is the Trade Federation ambassador in Star Wars: A Phantom Menace,
Oh
Queen
well.
Amidala, that voice. But he actually narrates most of the Black Library. So if you've
Right.
heard, any Warhammer novels in audio, it's probably Toby Longworth who you've heard. He's amazing. He's got like, 13, 14 voices. So he can have a conversation with himself. And you don't know, which is amazing. So, yeah.
Great. So we've talked a fair bit about Fractal. Um, are there any other projects, perhaps not related to the Fractal series, that you're working on now, or upcoming projects?
Yeah, so I'm doing so I finished in 2023, I finished the Historical Dictionary of Fantasy Literature for Rowman and Littlefield, um, which came out in June last year, which was a mammoth book. And now I'm working on the science fiction one. So unfortunately, Brian Stableford, who produced the first edition of the fantasy book and the first edition of the science fiction one, passed away about a month or so ago. Um, and which it was he'd not been well for a long period of time, so it wasn't unexpected, I don't think, in that regard. But obviously a massive loss. Um, I had the privilege of revisiting his work to compile the second edition of the fantasy book, and now I'm going through again. I mean, there was a second edition of the science fiction book done in 2014 by another writer, but basically I'm going through those 2 editions to produce the third edition at the moment, um, which is a lot of work. There's a lot of work. So I'm working on that. We have some new fractal stuff which I've done a bit of work on. I I made a kind of bargain with myself to do another draft of my dreadful fantasy novel, which was the first novel that I ever wrote. I finished that in April. So that now needs, I've just had some edits in, that now needs going through the edits to then shape that up to go out. I then had a really interesting May. So I said December had been last year had been the month that I'd written the most ever. Well, then I tried a different technique in May because I'd had this really an idea that wouldn't go out of my head since Easter, for a completely new fantasy book. Because of course I needed a completely new fantasy book to write when I already had deadlines for science fiction books and for non-fiction work. So obviously I needed a completely new book, in my head. So I just said, okay, right, well, I'll let you write this in May, but you can have all of May, but you write as much as you can, and then So I got 62,000 words done in a month, and it wasn't because in the December when I'd done sort of 58,000 to finish Vigilance, I was using all my normal methods, and basically my life started to fall apart towards the end of December because I couldn't do anything else. It was taking longer and longer during the day to get the word count to where I needed it to be. So every other activity was kind of falling away. Whereas when I was working on this new idea in May, it was great. Every day I hit my word total, went off and did the rest of my day, hit my word total, went off to the rest of my day, which was really amazing. Didn't recapture that in June, but then I'm working on the dictionary in June. And now I'm just trying to do a bit more on the dictionary, but also now shift into working on the fractal stuff as well. So yeah, so there's that. I've then got doing something for an American board game company that they've just started. They're doing a board game and a kind of online role-playing game thing about sailing ships in space, called the Starless Seas, which
Okay.
we're working on something together at the moment, which is lovely. Then I've got something out with PS Publishing, so they're doing an anthology of stories celebrating Robert Holstock,
Right.
who people will know from Mythago Wood, but may not know. Some crowds do know that he also wrote the novella The Dark Wheel, which came out with Elite back in 1984. So of course I worked on Elite Dangerous, the sequel, so I was very familiar with The Dark Wheel. But Heartwood is based on the Mythago Wood mythos, and it's a selection of stories from, I mean, some amazing authors in there. I'm really privileged to be in with, Adrian Tchaikovsky and others in that. It's being edited by Dan Cox, and and it's an awesome thing. So we don't have a publication date yet, but I mean it's going to be really, really cool. Then Parsec magazine are doing a Worldcon special edition, which I have a story on that, called Visiting Day, which is about children being bought by androids from
Nice.
shop window. And then
Wait, children being bought by androids from a shop.
yeah,
So but that sounds like the reverse of Clara and the Sun.
yeah, okay,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, but it actually it kind of, I think it started as a little workshop story about this child being put in a shop window and trying desperately to smile, knowing that if they didn't get bought within 2 weeks, then they may disappear,
Right.
and so basically taking a little bit of the kind of abandoned pets process and kind of
Right.
the way in which pet sanctuaries at the moment across the country, the way in which they work sometimes, which is just heartbreaking, when
Yeah.
you think about the detail of it, or veterinary practices when pets are abandoned with them, it's absolutely heartbreaking. So it was taking something of that, and then I just kind of took it a bit further, and then there was another twist to the plot towards the end. So yeah, so there's a variety of things there. What else am I doing? Something else. Oh, yeah, there's a commissioned, Flame Tree are doing a commissioned selection of science fiction for Worldcon. They're doing a little booklet. So I'm editing that for them, which was announced a couple of months ago. The entries have been in. I think the deadline was early June, and I have the final selection literally today. So I've got to read through the final list and make the decisions about which ones are going in the book.
Oh.
Yeah,
Oh, it's
I
plenty to
I
keep you
I
busy.
I don't stop. I don't
Yeah.
I don't slow down.
And
It's nice actually. Life has got to a place where a lot of the things I like, I get to do, which is
that's
lovely.
great. Yeah. And you've got things like the BSFA on top of that. I don't know how much uh, that of your time that takes up and what exactly you do for that.
Yeah,
Are you still writing reviews?
I write reviews occasionally. So
Yeah.
usually now it's when something grabs me. I think the last one I did was February.
Okay.
There was a really good preview book that somebody sent in, um, which was great, and and I reviewed that. So yeah, so I still occasionally put my hand into that. Occasionally write an article for Focus. Occasionally write an article for Vector. Um, Try and stay on top of the website. Try and make sure the AGM runs properly, and then we get minutes, and then sort of help out with the different bits and pieces, because generally speaking, as the chair, you're kind of hoping that a lot of the different elements work, and you
Yeah.
then come in either just to to do a little bit, or if there's a crisis, or if it's a new thing, you kind of support people. So I did a lot of the editing for BSFA Pod. So we started producing BSFA Pod a few weeks ago, which are narrated short stories from fiction. And so I edited those, as in I did the audio editing for those, which was great. We got some lovely actors, or some, volunteers to come in to read the pieces. Are really good. And Zoe Mandus did the initial kind of polish and then just gave it over to me. So I then assembled it and sent it back to her, and she then did the release. So you just want to be a cog in the wheel, if you can, in terms of doing that. But yeah, I mean, it's my last year now, so I'll step down as chair in June next year. So,
Okay.
which will have been 6 years. Yeah, it's going to be a interesting change. It's been lovely. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so if there's anyone here who's like learning about you for the first time, where can they go online to find out more about you and your work?
You can find me really. I have this interestingly spelt first name. Allen usually finds me.
Right.
There's a if you put that with Stroud, it usually finds me. There's a chap in America who I think has passed away, who's a news broadcaster, who occasionally finds that's not me. The one that's in the UK is me. But yeah, so usually that finds me. AllenStroud.com does get to me. It needs an update. I need to get and do that. Perhaps this summer it's on the to-do list. Yeah, I mean, that's usually the place to do so. Or the BSFA website, chair at BSFA reaches me. Flame Tree have also got a profile, and there are a couple of links to different pages with the Fractal series and with the music and the other bits and pieces. So yeah, there's a few places I can, and I can also be found lurking around conventions.
Right.
Not in a bad way.
That does sound kind of creepy.
Yeah, okay, I'll try and make that better. I can usually be found in conventions.
Yeah.
That probably does sound better, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean the BSFA table, participating on program. I'm usually doing stuff on different bits of programming or wherever else. So yeah, you'll find us there. We'll certainly this year. Worldcon's the big thing. So, most people are at that. But then obviously NovaCon in November, where I'm the guest of honor. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to that too.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time this evening. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I wish you all the success with all of your endeavors, especially with Vigilance just around the corner. I think I'm one of the first people who've read it, because when I had a look on Goodreads and it had 0 ratings.
Yeah.
So I feel quite privileged.
Either that or solitary. But let us hope that that's not the case for too long. It goes out to, obviously, the pre-release versions go out beforehand. I am sure that that a few people have picked it up, which let's just hope they like it, right?